Hello and welcome to SIPS Level 5 Advanced Diploma in Procurement and Supply Revision Tips. This is Module 2, Managing Supply Chain Risk, and it's Learning Outcome 2, which is to understand and analyse processes in managing risks in supply chains. So every contract carries inherent risks in its performance or non-performance. So we're going to look at how that process works. So an example could include construction work. This puts workers at risk of injury, especially if the work is done to if it's not done to the safe standards specified in the contract. Or supplying defective goods under a contract can have a quality and safety risk. Now, having identified and analysed the nature of the risk, it would be good to allocate to one of the parties of the contract. So determine who is going to be responsible for that risk and who's going to be liable. The contract allocates the risks to the parties, and these risks become the party's liability. Now, each party will need to minimise the liability by either physical means or contractual means. So, for example, if a party has a responsibility for a risk of detrimental ground conditions in a contract, they may decide to carry out significant physical ground investigations to reduce the liability, or they may wish to pass this liability on to a subcontractor. A contractual party that has had liability is the party's responsibility for a specific outcome in that contract. Now, all parties to a contract will usually have some liabilities. Examples include liability to provide the goods and services, or a liability to pay for the products or services. An indemnity is a way of moving potential costs from one party to another. The party giving the indemnity covers the other party for the damages or loss they incur. Now, liability indemnity clause insurance claims will often find these in contracts as clauses, where one party tries to avoid taking responsibility for something, or alternatively to indicate where responsibility should lie if it happens. Now, in addition to this, there is also statutory requirements on both the supplier and the buyer to observe the Health and Safety at Work Act and any related legislations and regulations. Supplier has a responsibility to comply with it, and it's their duty to ensure that staff working at the premises of the buyer comply with health and safety requirements. There may also be a requirement to indemnify the buyer against any liability costs, losses, or expenses sustained by the buyer if the supplier fails to comply with the relevant legislation. So liability refers to whether a party has responsibility for something, and there are two types. We've got strict liability, which is a situation where the entity, like the organisation, is legally responsible for damage or loss caused by acts or omissions, regardless of fault. And vicarious liability is where a superior will bear responsibility for the acts of its subordinates. So organisations generally liable for conduct of their employees. Indemnity clauses are designed to secure an undertaking from the other party that they will accept liability for any loss arising from the performance of the contract and make good any loss to the injured party. Insurance clauses confirm that the supplier has the ability to pay compensation in the event of any indemnities or legal claims arising against it. Now, intellectual property is defined as the creation of minds. This is different from physical or material property. So intellectual property is not physically divisible or divisible. It does not get used up as people use it. So, for example, if one person listens to a newly released song, it doesn't reduce the future requirement for other people to listen to that song. In this case, the song is the intellectual property of the artist. And this intellectual property ownership is a way of protecting a design, invention, or know-how that is shared with the supply chain in order for the members of the supply chain to carry out the work that's required. And intellectual property rights are used to encourage innovation in the economy. So an organisation or person that creates intellectual property can have it protected by law for a length of time so that they can profit from it. This encourages investments in research and design, resulting in innovation that drive economic growth to our economy. So common types of intellectual property include inventions, designs, artistic works, computer codes, musics, and databases. It's important to protect intellectual property because the theft represents significant loss to an organisation and to the global economy. This forms barriers for businesses that compete fairly and harms efforts to create jobs and stimulate growth. And the four main types of intellectual protection are copyrights, patents, trademarks, and trade secrets. Now, a force majeure clause constitutes an attempt by the contracting parties to stipulate what will happen if some event beyond their contract's control interferes with the performance of the contract. But care is required with force majeure because suppliers have, for example, cited a strike by a transport company as a force majeure event and their ability not to deliver on time. But it could be argued that this could and should have been used to find another form of transport. The phrase act of God is seldom used in British contracts these days, but a good example of force majeure. It would be something like ash clouds resulting from volcanic eruptions, which we saw a few years ago, and it led to many aeroplane flights being cancelled or severely delayed. A force majeure clause is an attempt to limit the liability of the parties. Tornadoes or forest fires in susceptible areas may be hard to argue. But nonetheless, a force majeure clause should include a state of the events that will constitute force majeure, obligating either party to notify the other if force majeure event has occurred. It states that a party will not be considered in default of its contractual obligations if it can show that full performance was prevented by the force majeure event. And it provides for the contract to be suspended for up to 30 days. And then it provides for termination of the contract by mutual consent if the force majeure event continues to prevent performance for more than 30 days. Clauses for testing, inspection and acceptance are a method for reducing the risk that the product will have a defect. So you can see the normal flow of testing, inspection and acceptance. So testing clauses detail the tests that the product will have to pass and the pass or fail criteria. The testing may be carried out in any of the following ways: by the supplier, a third party, or the customer. Testing can happen before or after delivery to the customer, but once a product has been delivered, a set period of time is normally given during which the customer can inspect and accept the product or reject it. Inspection clauses can also give the buyers rights to access and assess to inspect the supplier's premises, processes and performances to monitor compliance prior to delivery. And successful acceptance is normally linked to payment. And a defect is a failure to perform to an acceptable standard. A latent defect is one that is not discoverable through reasonable physical inspection or testing. So, for example, a piece of equipment may pass initial testing and so be contractually accepted, but then fails, then put under full operational load because of a latent defect. So most contracts include a clause with a time limit with which claims for a latent defect have to be issued, and if not, the national law may have one. There are a range of additional risks introduced through global sourcing, such as those you can see on the screen. So you've got potential disruption to supply chain risks or supply failure, and that may be due to one or several of the steepled factors or exchange rates. Transport risks can cause challenges, such as loss, deterioration and damage, or theft due to the longer distance involved. Increased lead times for supply is caused by not only distance, but also the 3 Cs: congestion, climate, and customs requirements. So further issues and risks may be caused by a misunderstanding of requirements due to language or cultural issues or communication delays. Now, model forms of contracts are published by third-party experts, such as those that you can see on the screen. They're there for a particular purpose. They look to ensure a fair balance of contractual rights and responsibilities between the buyer and seller. And the model form contracts are used to some industries to simplify and standardize procurement, as they give a standard contract which could suit most purchases in that category. They're often certain to industries such as construction and engineering, but are becoming more common in logistics and facilities management. Here we can look at the key differences between NEC and FIDIC in the area of risk management. So the NEC contract requires you to have a risk register, which you populate at the outset and you keep up to date. And you will provide your notices of risks using something called early warning notices. The risks removed after the risks avoided, and it doesn't allocate contractual responsibility, whereas in the FIDICs, the risks allocated in the contract and each part manages their own risks. In terms of the notices, the NEC requires early warning notices that are given by either party as soon as the risk is identified, which allows for proactive risk mitigation. Where FIDIC says the contractor has 28 days to give notice in any event, giving rise to a claim, and the contractor has 42 days to detail the claim and any costs and extra time. And then on change control, for NEC, these are known as compensation events. So early warning notices are required, and it uses quotes prior to the change, combining time and cost. Where the FIDICs are called variations or claims, dealt with post-change and deals with time and cost separately. Now, over the past decade, best practice in procurement and supply chain has focused mainly on reducing the cost of supply. Organisations will naturally follow a range of different sourcing practices to suit their own requirements. And as supply chains become longer, more complex and more geographically spread, in order to chase lower costs, there are inherently more risks. Procurement practices include the following: have exposed supply chains to significantly higher risks. So outsourcing, supply base reduction, low cost country sourcing, and lean supply. Now, lean supply programs will aim to reduce the cost of stock holding and obsolescence. Lead times are lesser, which means that you might not need, or you might need to have some buffer stocks in the supply chain, but the effects of any disruption are therefore felt really quickly if production stops. Now, any supply chain disruption can quickly have devastating consequences. Low-cost country sourcing has led to additional transport links, causing more potential for disruption, exposure to many more geopolitical risks, and exposure to reputational risks. So let's now look at how organisational efficiency programs can lead to greater supply chain risks. So if you've got a cost down program in the middle, you may look to do low-cost country sourcing or outsourcing. The low-cost country sourcing will give you the geopolitical risks. Outsourcing will give you supplier risks. You could be going for supply-based reduction, which means that you're reliant on a single source, or lean supply chains, meaning that you've got less buffer stocks. Now, people and organisations tend to think that what they're doing is right and efficient and don't like to think that they're not. But it's also this belief that prevents them from seeing what they're doing that isn't helpful and isn't working. So it can help to have a third party that reviews the work of procurement to provide fresh eyes and an experienced overview so that that organisation can improve. It can also help to remove some of the preconditions of fraud and make it less likely. External parties can also advise on risks that the organisation may not have spotted themselves, so it can make their risk management process more robust. And finally, to achieve accreditation from a standards body, It is often necessary to be audited and then improve on the areas that don't yet meet the required standards. The three main credit rating agencies use a scale rating from low to high in terms of risks. But before deciding if a risk is something you cannot take, you do need to consider it alongside what you're buying. It's not only in terms of crowdjet, but also in terms of what terms you're using. Is it a spot purchase versus a term contract? So lower credit rated supplier for a non-critical supply or something that you're buying one off is probably okay. It's a small concern. Whereas if you've got a low credit rating on a big supplier, strategic, this is a big concern. And if the cause of poor rating is not a one-off, then further action should be taken. This could include a detailed risk assessment and mitigation planning, followed by a review with the supplier with a view to protecting supply. So do liaise with them to understand the cause, resource to an alternative supplier, or help them financially by giving them better payment terms, or request a parent company guarantee. But it's important not to solely rely on credit ratings for the following reasons. Suppliers can go into administration very quickly, and suppliers fail even in the absence of weak financial performance. A credit rating may not show dependencies that a supplier has on one or two customers, and it may not show that a portfolio of contracts the supplier has is not financially viable. And much information on risks come through informal channels. So supplier early warning sign monitoring should include operational and qualitative considerations as well as the credit rating agencies. So here are some of the warning signs to look out for. A reduction in money spent on facilities by suppliers. A reduction in non-critical activity like training. Increased staff turnover, which indicates low morale. An increase in requests for timely payments would suggest they've got cash flow problems. Information from industry networking. And risk auditing services are another form of third party that can assist in the management of the risk process. Specialist external auditors can be engaged to carry out independent investigations into corporate finances and internal controls of public companies. But in the private sector, it is a legal requirement for companies with an annual turnover above a defined threshold to have auditors report, which go directly to shareholders bypassing directors. Their role could include expressing an opinion on whether financial statements give a true or fair view of the financial position of the business. They're designed to create a reasonable expectation of detecting misstatements due to fraud or error. And they document any findings indicating fraud or error and report these to management. And in the public sector, this is undertaken by the National Audit Office or the Audit Commission. A supply chain audit is a systematic official inspection of the organisation's supply chain. A typical supply chain audit would look at some of the areas such as health and safety, environmental, quality, information security, social accountability or CSR, labour, and business continuity. And it's a useful tool because it reinforces the supply chain awareness of the organisation's requirements by allowing continuous monitoring and improvement, indicating to the organisation the steps needed to build a more sustainable supply chain. Now, qualified auditors with the correct skills and understanding of the organisation would essentially be lead to quite a successful audit, such as those that are not influenced by the supplier. So you could use a system of rotating the auditors to make sure you're managing the risk of influence and complacency. But the audit process can be following 4 stages. Firstly, the planning. So prioritise any high-risk areas and refer to your CSR policies. Carry out the audits by implementing audit procedures as they're key to success. And then reporting, distinguishing between systems and one-off failures. And the action, prioritise the follow-ups and corrective action plans. Now, the benefits and criticisms of supply chain audits are the benefits is it reinforces awareness of an organisation's requirements, allowing for monitoring and improvements, providing and proving to stakeholders that the organisation is serious about its supply chain compliance. But the criticisms is that full audits on the whole of the supply chains are very resource heavy, and they only cover one point at a time, no monitoring between the audits. Pre-announced audits can be manipulated and give false results. So as well as offering operational expertise during the audit, many third-party audits offer value in a number of ways, such as sharing data and case studies that help organisations build a case for auditing expenditure, help to train organisational staff, create a customer network so that you can learn from one another, and an award scheme so organisations can achieve and highlight their achievements. Now, disaster recovery is the restoration of essential systems to allow a business to perform critical processes following an incident. So typical incidents that require disaster recovery would be cyber attacks, fire at a business location, a geopolitical event, natural disaster or power outage, and workplace violence. Now, this shows you that some reasons to outsource disaster recovery services and gives you examples of third-party providers that exist. So you've got public emergency services like the police, the ambulance and the fire service. And then you've got the disaster recovery, which is covered in a little bit more detail. So third parties may use this to aid with disaster recovery because staff and managers could be traumatized by the event and not in a position to respond effectively. These services are trained, they have the expertise and the equipment to resource and respond effectively and efficiently. Now, the disaster recovery service could include commercial services for off-site backup of cloud-based hosting, ICT systems and data center recovery, or call centers to maintain customer services and logistics, sources of alternative premises, grants and financial assistance, and public emergency services. We're now going to discuss the use of insurance against risk. Insurance is something that we tend to be familiar with from our lives outside of work, but there are some specialist insurance used in procurement. Hedging is a technical instrument, a technical financial instrument used to protect against risks. But there are two financial products that help to reduce the financial loss in the event of a risk happening. Hedging, where you're offsetting the effects of the price variations, and insurance, which covers some types of risks, which involves paying a premium. So here you can see an example of how hedging might work in practice. If a contract was based on a price of $100, then the buyer would purchase financial instrument known as swaps for two scenarios. One where the price went up and one where the price went down. If the actual price alters, then one of the swaps will lead to a payout, but the other won't, and the money to purchase it will have been wasted. However, the net effect of the purchase will cost the buyer $100 in total, but it might be made up of multiple elements, i.e. the higher price paid to the supplier, but with compensation paying out from a swap, or a lower price paid by the supplier and a payment to a swap that didn't pay out. So a gambling equivalent is betting the same amount on both horses in a two-horse race. One bet will win and the other will lose, and the net effect will be zero. Now, hedging is used to cover all sorts of risks, such as exchange rate movements and stock movements, raw material costs and adverse weather, changes in the commodity prices, and fluctuations in interest rates. And there are several other ways of dealing with volatile commodity prices besides hedging. Clearly, we can do nothing and pass the price on to the customer. We can go for an ingredient substitution, work closely with the manufacturer and supplier to find cheaper alternatives. We can negotiate long-term contracts that share the risk with the supplier, or we can acquire the supplier so you can control within the organisation. The categories of insurance will include employer's liability, public liability, and professional indemnity. Some might also have products and trade insurance, depending on your industry. The employer liability covers an employee for costs when employees make a claim for an injury that happened at work or a disease caused by work. Public liability covers the third party if they're injured and they make a claim. Not normally a legal requirement, but recommended for customer-facing businesses. Professional indemnity covers the legal cost and compensation due to a customer if adequate or inadequate advice was provided by a law firm or a consultant. Product liability will cover some of the costs if a product or service injures somebody or damages property. And then trade credit insurance provides cover for an organisation's debtors, so the customers that owe them the money, protecting the organisation's accounts receivable from any losses as a result of their customers for not paying due to going into insolvency. The insurance premiums are normally a percentage of the monthly sales, and there is usually a claim limit for each customer. Having trade credit insurance can give an organisation more confidence to take on new customers and grow their business. Now, BI stands for business interruption, and CBI is contingent business interruption. And you can get insurance provided through property insurance policies. So a BI policy will cover loss of profits following damage as a result of an insured peril to a policyholder's facility, while CBI policy covers for the loss of profits following damage as a result of the injured peril that shuts down a policyholder in terms of the customer or suppliers. But both require physical damage to a property like floods, fires, storms, earthquakes in order to trigger the insurance. But there are some legal principles of insurance. The first is something called utmost good faith, that both parties must fully disclose information. Indemnity is to put back to a position where it was before. You can't profit from it. You need to have an insurable interest. So in essence, you can only insure something you have partial ownership of. Contribution: if insurance has multiple policies, you can only claim one value of the loss. And subrogation is where owners take over the rights of insureds after the claim, so the insurer can claim off the negligent third party. And proximate clause is where more than one event caused a loss. A proximate clause is used to decide the liability. Now, underwriters evaluate insurance applications by analysing risks involved by using statistics of probability. Essentially, the higher the risk, the higher the premium. And an important part of the insurance process is the claims and how they've been made. This flowchart here shows you the steps involved, but notice that there will often be an external party commissioned by the insurer to assess if a claim is paid and the amount to be paid. They're known as the loss adjuster. Now, as supply chains become longer, more complicated, more geographically dispersed, the chances of a serious incident causing a supply chain interruption increases. And a survey in 2018 found the most common cause for supply chain disruption. So 53% experienced IT or telecoms failures, 41% due to adverse weather, 33% for cyber attacks, 20% loss of talent, and 27% problems with transport. So a contingency plan is a course of action to help you to efficiently respond to a serious incident. So these could be a fire, a natural disaster, a cyber attack, some form of financial failure, strikes or terror attacks, wars, human error, or power outages. Developing and managing an effective contingency plan takes the same form as many other risk management tasks. So you need to set yourself a policy to begin with and then analyze the impact. Design some solutions that mitigate the risks. Implement it. Run test scenarios, carry out real life drills, and periodically revisit and review to continuously improve. It is inevitable that some things will go wrong in an organization, though the risk eventually will happen. Disaster recovery and business continuity are the terms given to an action taken when there's a catastrophic event that prevents your organization from operating normally. Imagine a flood that stopped a factory from working or a telecoms cable in a contract center being cut. The facility couldn't operate normally, and this is the type of impact that the area of concern is with. The first thing is to get as many of the operations back up and running as quickly as possible. There may be a need for an immediate transfer to other facilities. This would represent an instant response and disaster recovery stage, but the organisation would also need to repair the damage that stopped the operation from continuing as normal, and they need to do something whilst this is happening, as the overflow facilities may be able to cope in the short term, but not in the long term. This would be the business continuity phase whilst the organisation returns to the way it was before it happened. So this diagram shows you how an organisation's output would look graphically before and during an incident and the following business continuity plan implementation. So everything was fine up until the incident happened, output dropped, you were responding to the incident, moving into disaster recovery, and then you get onto your business continuity plan a little bit later on to bring your output back up to where it was before the incident happened. And that's the end of the session. Thank you for watching.